Support comes from BECU, a member-owned credit union putting people over profit, offering financial services and support to the community with access to local financial centers, over 30,000 ATMs, and online resources at becu.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
Hey, it's Paige Browning in for Patricia Murphy. It's Tuesday. This is Seattle Now. The J&J vaccine is still on hold while the CDC and FDA look into possible side effects. In the meantime, folks who were relying on a one-shot vaccine are left in the lurch. Seattle Times reporter Sydney Brownstone will explain how the J&J pause is hindering plans to vaccinate the city's homeless. But first, let's get you caught up. With all eyes on Minneapolis as a jury deliberates in the Derek Chauvin murder trial, Seattle police say they're changing their approach to handling protests and crowds ahead of any possible protests here. SPD says it will try to have a smaller presence when possible, do more to make sure media, legal observers, and medics can safely do their jobs, and do a better job at communicating with large crowds. The department also flagged specific illegal actions they're watching for, like throwing bottles or rocks, blocking traffic, marching on freeways, and interfering in an arrest. Some good news for Seattle's financial picture: the city's economy may already be rebounding after a year plus of pandemic downturns. A new budget forecast puts the estimated revenue in 2021 at almost $1.6 billion. That's $20 million more than the city thought it would bring in this year. And keep wearing those masks, people. Seattle is just a sneeze away from being on the wrong side of Governor Inslee's COVID dashboard. As of Sunday, King County was officially over the threshold of 200 COVID cases per 100,000 people. The official number, for any numbers people, was 201.7. Hospitalizations are still below the red line, though, and we have to fail both to go backward. We'll find out if Seattle gets to stay in Phase 3 in early May. There are close to 12,000 people experiencing homelessness in King County. 12,000. And just like everyone else, it's important for those folks to get COVID vaccines. Many nonprofits were relying on Johnson & Johnson's one-shot vaccine to overcome the logistical barriers of vaccinating people living outside. But the pause on using the Johnson & Johnson is throwing a wrench in that plan. Sydney Brownstone has been covering the vaccination effort for the Seattle Times, and she's here to tell us about it. Hey, Sydney.
Hey, Paige. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So actually, before we talk about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, can you just tell us about the impact of the pandemic and what it's been like for folks who are experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, there are many different kinds of ways to experience homelessness. So if you were in shelter at the beginning of the pandemic, your circumstances actually may have improved. You likely went into a place that was less crowded because of the concerns around transmission inside overcrowded congregate shelters. You may have gotten into a hotel room. You may have gotten into a single shelter. You may have even gotten housing. But if you were living outside the shelter system, and there are more than 5,000 people who do in King County, things likely got a lot worse for you. A lot of people who were living outside and relied on a kind of cobbling together of resources from different places suddenly found themselves bereft of those resources. And that was really, really extreme when it came to hygiene and sanitation. All of a sudden, people didn't have access to water. They didn't have places to go to the bathroom. They didn't have places to wash their clothes. They didn't have places to just go inside for a few hours away from the elements or use technology in the library. The experience has been really split depending on how you were living when the pandemic broke out.
Okay, so this is the context for the attempt to get vaccines to unhoused folks. And many people's lives have been upended over the last year, as you've described. What was the plan for making sure people who are homeless are able to get vaccinated?
Yeah, so people who are homeless recently became eligible to receive the vaccine. So the county public health officials have been doing vaccination clinics in shelters. And that's a lot easier to access people if you know where they're going to be. And because of the pandemic, people are staying in shelter longer. So it's easier to keep track of people who are already in shelter. But for people living outside, the plan was later this month to start sending out mobile teams or doing pop-up clinics where people living outside often access resources. And the idea was to hopefully rely on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, because you only need one shot, and it can be really difficult to follow someone who's not in the system all the time, and you don't necessarily know where they're going, and they're moving their campsite quite often. Which I should add was not just preferred for people living homeless, but also in rural areas, places where people are really difficult to access. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine was kind of seen as a solution to that.
Yeah, and people who are incarcerated as well. This was sort of a priority vaccine for them. How big of a blow is this pause on the J&J vaccine? Because it's possible we could get the green light to start using Johnson & Johnson again really any day now.
Right. And so logistically, not that big of a blow, right? If people can go back to using the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, then those logistical problems kind of disappear. But the bigger barrier may be a psychological one, and one of perception. So, when we're talking about people who live outside, we're talking about people who have been extremely isolated from society and in many ways cast out. A lot of them have had really negative experiences with the medical establishment because of the treatment they've received in emergency rooms. Many of them are people of color who have had histories of, racist experiences with the medical establishment. And, there's a lot of history there of people of color being used as test subjects by the healthcare establishment. There's already a high level of distrust. When I was speaking to one nonprofit that works with people in encampments, they expressed a fear that if at the outset you say you have to come back for 2 doses of this, people who are already distrustful of the system are going to be like, you know what, not for me. And, there was already a negative perception of Johnson & Johnson to begin with because of the misinformation around efficacy rates that we've seen. A lot of people are doing kind of direct comparisons of Johnson & Johnson's efficacy rate to the other 2 vaccines, which you really can't do because at the time that efficacy rate was determined, it was being tested against a backdrop where there were different variants. It was in different places. You can't make like a one-to-one comparison of numbers between Johnson & Johnson and the other 2. So there was already a negative perception about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And then there's the perception that because of this pause that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is unsafe, and that, the prospect of getting a 2-dose immunization is a barrier that many people might not want to overcome.
So, Sydney, distrust is a big issue in this population. What is the new plan? How are outreach workers getting the vaccine to people who are homeless?
The plan is still to roll out vaccinations to people living outdoors later this month. We'll see whether providers have access to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine or whether it's going to require 2 doses. I mean, this is a time when this effort is going to rely on pre-existing relationships between outreach providers and homeless folks. It's not like a bunch of people in white coats are going to show up to an encampment with a bunch of needles, So I would say that it's really dependent on the long-term relationships that have been developing over the last year. My colleague Scott Greenstone went and visited a vaccination clinic last week in which people were being offered gift cards, $10 gift cards, in addition to their vaccine, which is a great incentive. So we may see more of that too.
I'm wondering, what now? What are you watching for next?
I guess the thing that I will be looking for, in addition to, the relative success or failure of this campaign to get people vaccinated outdoors, is if the vaccination efforts come with any other resources for basic needs. As I said earlier, people really saw those resources disappear over the course of the pandemic, just hygiene, sanitation. I'm wondering if this focus on getting people outdoors vaccinated will also bring attention to some of their other needs, because in conversations that I've had with people living in encampments, the pandemic is not their first concern. They face an elevated risk of dying every day just by living in the elements. So, survival, housing are the first 2 items on people's to-do list most of the time. And so vaccination may fall after that. And I think that healthcare providers have to recognize that and respect it as well.
Sydney Brownstone is a reporter at the Seattle Times. Thanks so much for your time, Sydney.
Thanks for having me, Paige. Great to talk to you.
Seattle Now is produced by Clare McGrane, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our music. I'm Paige Browning. See you next time.